My guest today is Kryptogal, aka Kate. She is a pseudonymous writer on Substack and the author of some very interesting, very feisty, very spicy articles about, of course, the relationship between the genders in the 21st century. We talk about childless women, childless men, who wants to have kids more. We talk about baby fever, the physical cost of children for women, the status as a deterrent to having kids. We also talk about the social construction of femininity, but not of masculinity, and the fact that the Republicans and the so-called right wing have decided to be the party of low-status men. There's all sorts of things in this conversation. I think you'll enjoy it. And if you'd like to participate in the community, listen to the whole backlog archive of episodes I've ever done, and yeah, just be a contributing member and keep the lights on Subversive. Please go to ak dot com. No, it's alexkashuta.com and patreon.com/aksubversive if you want to make a contribution on Patreon. So enjoy this conversation with Kryptogal. I think you will like this one. So you've been a commenter on a lot of the issues, the most pressing issues of the day, especially in terms of dating discourse and the ever so fraught relations between men and women. And I think one of the essays that really piqued my interest in your commentary was the one on birth rates and why women have so surprisingly decided to have fewer children. And I think it was prompted by the stat that was going around about, for the first time in history, men are the ones who want more children than women. I mean, what's going on? Are the women insane? I mean, what do you think is behind all this? It does seem quite.
Yeah, and I, I wrote that a couple months ago because I'd noticed the topic. There was just more discourse about it, and a few articles in the New York Times and various outlets, but it didn't seem to have really hit kind of broad awareness yet, and now it has. I think a lot because of sort of JD Vance and maybe the 2025 project, and suddenly people are talking about it more than they were even 2 months ago. Um, at at the time, it was all men. I mean, that's the thing. And yet they're talking about women, really. When they talk about birth rates and they talk about couples and fertility, they're only ever really talking about women. And it was, I mean, I know you've talked about it yourself, but that was sort of rare in the space. I think a year ago, 2 years ago, for it to be not a man. So that kind of bothered me that they're not really um, and the other thing is that they were constantly just acting as if they couldn't figure out the reason, and it was a total head scratcher,
Mhm.
which to me is like, really, I mean, just ask them and listen to the answers. Now I suppose it's of interest to me because I didn't want to have kids, which I think is a very rare position, and it will remain a very rare position. I had plenty of friends who said they didn't want to back in high school or college or their 20s, and they all did. I'm like, I'd say it's 5-10% maybe who really don't. So I guess the first thing I want to say is just people don't need to worry about them. I think that's probably been a steady state that's not going to change. It's more, are people having two, three, one kid that's the issue as far as population goes. And I wanted to point out that you really can't talk about these things as if it's not a huge freaking deal for a woman to have a baby. I mean, it just is, and it just doesn't seem recognized enough to me. To me, it's very apparent, and maybe that's just because I'm a little more standing on the outside. But um, so yes, there's money issues. Yes, there's economic issues. Yes, there's cultural issues. All of that definitely comes into play. But at least whenever I would hear Ross, do that, and the typical commenters over the past year or two, they just didn't seem to take into that take that into account, which is sort of such a hard, just on a biological basis, forget society, forget what system we're living in, forget what the housing situation is. If we were just looking at, caveman days or living on the savannah, the cost to women are about 1,000 times or more, 10,000 times than it is to men. So you would expect, just looking at that, that men are going to be more interested than women, right? Now add in all the social aspects, and that changes the calculus even more. But I think as far as that stat about men and women, you know, because it was pretty high. It was like almost half of young women say that they don't want to have kids. I don't believe that that will stay that way. I don't feel, I don't think they're going to still think that when they're in their 30s, probably. But it's something I think most young guys just don't even ever think about. They just assume they will. They don't really think about it. They don't spend 20 to 30 years of their life actively on birth control or thinking about having to have birth control, worrying about this, going to the OBGYN, every year like women do. So women just think about it more, which is probably why there's a discrepancy more than anything, I would think. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong and there will be a bunch of women who actually don't, but I doubt it.
Yeah, I think there are definitely more people in my orbit and like in real life that have expressed this as a like they voiced this as a preference. Like I have a few people that I grew up with who say that they want to be, child free by choice, and they're already kind of in their early 30s. So it could be that they actually will be child free by choice. But I have more people that just can't really find the right relationship or right situation for them. They've been in, serially monogamous situations where it just didn't pan out. The guy was either unreliable or he just really wasn't into this whole combination. I think only online do you see this whole stereotype of the guy itching for marriage and the flaky woman who just doesn't, he's just not interested in having a family and
Yeah.
kids. And it does happen, but the proportions are definitely not what's being represented. But I also think it's just the gender divide that you see on the right, like the fact that most commenters, as you've noted, are men. They are projecting their idea of women, of what they imagine to be baby fever, which is a phenomenon that I think some women have, but it's not a generalizable thing. Like, for example, didn't have baby fever. I have two kids. I'm very glad I had them, but it was a very rational calculus, as is pretty much everything I do. It's not very something that's just like emerging from my loins and I have to have this. It only emerged from the fact that I found a man who was genuinely a good partner, very good father, probably a better father than I am a mom. So it really, it was kind of the alchemy of that whole situation that kind of resulted in kids. But the idea that on the ground there is an epidemic of gentle young men just like yearning for 6 kids and a farm. Yeah, this is just an artifact of the internet. I just don't think that's the case. I think, the stereotypes are true. I think most men are like, if it happens, it happens, but they're not like actively searching for it. Whereas a lot of young women are still very much searching for it.
I mean, so in your perception, so you're a millennial, I guess, and the people that you know that are in their 30s that you would say are sort of purposely, actively not wanting to have kids, do you see a gender discrepancy there? Because I mean, among the people I know, I don't. It's a very tiny proportion, and it's equal men and women.
Yeah, well, I know about the women because we talk about these things.
Yeah,
The men that I know do not express a preference, either way. They're at least a lot of them are not really doing anything to help that situation if they're
yeah,
actually
they'll
trying
kind
to
of go.
have kids.
They'll kind of go along with whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it might very well be the case that more. I mean, I agree with you. I don't perceive this to be a thing at all in actual life. I mean, I live in Utah, which is the most child friendly on multiple ways. I mean, first of all, the Mormon religion, obviously, there is just a very pro having kids culture, but also the laws here. I mean, there's a lot of things. So, and it's the youngest, and we have the highest birth rate, the youngest median population, et cetera. And most everybody here has kids. So I'm around, I'm like an outlier in a very pro child friendly society. And I don't see much of a difference between, I do, I guess if anything, I would say I perceive the young men wanting to put it off for longer. That's probably true. Like definitely they don't want to in their 20s, that's for sure. And then among the women, that's also probably what they want to put it off if they're sort of professional class establishing a career. The ones who aren't, I don't know. They're probably more willing to do it younger, but I don't. I mean, I agree with you. It's the online thing. It's a very specific online thing, and the people writing about it also are like frankly hysterical. The way that they talk about a collapse is just to me ridiculous. But I think a lot of it is just that there's people are shifting when they do it, and most people are not going to do it till they're 30.
Yeah, I think it's, as far as I know, like typically the collapse actually happened in the sense that there's not really much of teenage pregnancy anymore.
Yeah,
So that's a
right.
big chunk of it. And then people who used to have like 4 kids now have 3 kids. People who used to have 3 kids now have 2 kids, something like that. So it's kind of at the margins for normal families, or, oopsie daisy type situations that have been eliminated. Obviously,
Yeah,
very good, very
right,
effective programs and
right.
in schools and all that. But the idea that shaming people into having more kids, all of this, pressure tactics, you're going to die alone with cats, like that's not really, number one, not really addressing the actual cause of the reduction in fertility. It's not, the women who decide to not have kids. That's not the main chunk. It's just families deciding that for whatever reason they want to have a smaller brood, and teenagers not getting knocked up. I mean, exactly. I don't exactly know. Maybe the right wing would be very much on board for teenagers getting knocked up. Some of
Some of
them
them
are,
definitely are. They'll say
yeah,
so explicitly.
it's
Yeah,
Lindy. That's
yeah.
how it's always worked. Our ancestors were knocking up teenagers left and right. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure any of this works, especially because where it's coming from. I think that's a big problem and a big stink with the right wing, which is somehow managed to decide that being the party of the section where low status men can thrive is the best policy. At the same time, being very much understanders of elite theory, and the idea that elite opinion drives politics. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. The idea that we're going to have pussy communism plus elite theory, you know only if there's going to be some sort of Bronze Age collapse, and then the guy with the greatest grip strength is going to have a harem of 100 women, and then obviously the guys who are low in testosterone right now are not going to be at the table. They're not going to be dining in the longhouse. I'm sorry to say, you're going to be out there either on a spike at the gates of the city, or
Yeah,
exiled in the desert with
yeah,
exactly zero pussy.
yeah.
I don't know what to say.
I'm no, that's that's true, and I try to point that out, and I mean, it's interesting because it's sort of I guess this is developed because there's kind of a weird overlap between, on the one hand, you have actual sort of traditional religious, traditional Catholics, and I grew up in a very Catholic area that still didn't have no fault divorce and all of that. So I have familiarity with that. And I also have familiarity from living in Utah where the Mormons are. So you have that aspect. They have a more coherent worldview, in my opinion. But then it also overlaps with the more secular, just kind of angry young guy that you're talking about, whose, life isn't what he expected it to be, or things aren't living up to what he wants. And I don't know what they think is going to happen when, with all these, tough guys, in their fantasy, they're going to be the ones that are just like beating them up and kicking them out and not going to stand for that. So I don't, they just project everything onto women. I guess maybe because it's like a soft target. It's easier. They're not going to do anything about it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's this whole idea that we were playing identity politics, and I think they identify with the cause of the white man, the builder of civilization, the inventor of the computer, the transistor, everything. There's a lot of kind of stolen valor here, and there's a lot of you know the feeling that it's kind of like those we was kangs memes where back in the day. Not saying, obviously the West has quite a lot to speak for it, but the idea that some, 20-year-old guy today who's not, in a good position to have a stable job is somehow the inheritor of the invention of the transistor is quite
Yeah.
laughable. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that does actually worry me about, fertility collapse, and I think is quite an important element, is the fact that, the West is a place where, we have the first fertility sink, and not for the first. East Asia is the first, but
Yeah.
culturally speaking, on a global scale, the West really is the place where it's actually quite important to maintain some sort of population, because we like the West. I like the West. There's all sorts of ways in which the West is kind of a candle in the dark in a world that is really filled with a lot of barbarism, and especially if you care about women's rights and liberalism in the smallest L you could imagine. The idea that the world population is going to skew very much non-white very quickly is not necessarily. I'm not necessarily convinced that there's a problem with very specific ethnic groups or anything, but culturally, this is the place that I'd like to thrive. And if it's just not going to, I think that is a worry. And I think, to be honest, behind a lot of this fertility talk, half of it is guys who can't, even get
Yeah.
sex. Which, and then obviously they imagine that they, in an ideal situation, they'd be a patriarch of a family of 10 people, whatever. And then there's this idea that, okay, this is actually about a very specific kind of person, a very specific kind of birth rate. It's not just like, there are countries in the world where the birth rate is quite steep and quite stiff still, even though everywhere it's going down and everywhere it's going down
Yeah.
very quick. That's just an artifact of modernity. Even in Iran, you can have the steeliest theocracy, and even there, even in Afghanistan, it's going down. So, there's some sort of cultural protection. If we install our memes, it's going to solve itself, is insane. But yeah, I think it is a worry in the sense that I just really do care what type of world my children will inherit, and one where the West is powerful and hegemonic in some way is quite the one that I'd like.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, so would I. And I mean, my husband was living in Afghanistan for many years in the 2000s. I've heard all about how things are there for women and children, and how Stone Age and barbaric that country is. I mean, they don't even have a literacy rate of a third. Less than a third of people can read in that country. So, yeah, I have absolutely no interest in that. I would imagine that being in Europe, that whole sort of influence and situation is probably more frightening, just because borders and proximity and policies, that would be scarier than it probably is in the US, where you have two giant oceans. And I don't know, the immigration and that sort of thing is a sort of a different situation here. Although I was looking at it, and the fertility rates in sort of Central and South America, which is where most of our immigrants have come from traditionally, have really gone down massively in the past like 10, 20 years. So, on the other hand, this is the kind of thing that a lot of, very rich people, Bill Gates and everything, have been trying to, not get people to have more kids in the Western world, but get people everywhere else to get control of their fertility and not be having 6, 7 kids. They've been doing that for a long time, and the right has completely built it up in their head as some kind of agenda conspiracy that doesn't even really make sense, because it sort of directly contradicts other things they think they're doing. And I mean, really, I think it was pretty clearly that they were thinking that it's not a good thing to have the continent of Africa full of way more young people than those cultures are possibly capable of taking care of. And then they're going to overrun other places that are much nicer places to live with, welfare type benefits and all kinds of stuff that can't handle that influx. I mean, and I guess I find it interesting that a lot of these things that go together, the housing crisis and YIMBYism and all this, they all reside in some of the people that are pushing it, mostly on the right, although there's a few on like Matt Iglesias that are on the left, and they don't. I don't really see a cohesive. Like, to me, a lot of these things, their positions seem directly contradictory. I mean, so for example, again, Utah has the highest. Well, South Dakota had the higher birth rate in a couple years because of an oil boom, but outside of that, Utah's always had the highest birth rate. It's been by not absolute numbers, by actual just percentage growth. For 20 years, it's had the fastest growth rate in the country. And we also, it's a very pro-building, pro-business. They're constantly building houses here. I've lived here for 20 years. There's cranes everywhere. They're building housing nonstop, and they have the highest number of new starts in the country and all of that. And it doesn't matter, because when your population increases that much, so do the housing prices. So housing prices are unaffordable everywhere in the US, but they've increased twice as much here than they have everywhere else. And it's not because of zoning, and it's not because of regulation. It's not because of any of that, because they build more here. It's just there's not really a plan for growing that fast. So the people who want just growth forever, they're a little bit just ignoring everything they don't want to and saying, oh, somehow it's going to work out. Well, it's not, because when a house that was $120,000 20 years ago now costs $600,000 here, which is a much bigger increase than it has been everywhere else. There's no sort of end sight. Like, when does the exponential growth end? 15 billion, 30 billion, 50 billion. There's no plan for that. And if you ask them, their answer ultimately always comes down to, we have to go intergalactic. I just think, like, that's not a good plan. I don't know. I'm okay with going to either a slow decrease or just steady state until you can figure out those things, then great. But just hoping that you figure them out, then I don't know, it's going to be a lot worse. If we kept growing at the rate of the 20th century, it's not possible. And nobody would be able to afford anything, and everybody's going to be fighting over resources. So there's not a lot of balance in the conversation, and that's mostly because the people that aren't on the pro fertility, pro growth side are the only ones talking about it, and the other side hasn't even really been talking about it. So they've just sort of assumed that it's kind of obvious what the problems are with never-ending growth. I guess they're not really making the case. It would be nice, maybe, I guess, if there was a little bit more pushback that, yes, there's problems with no growth and there's problems with growth. I mean, both of them create different problems. But
Yeah.
I mean, Utah, what used to be, when I moved here, it was one of the reasons I moved here was because it was extremely affordable to have a really nice quality of life. It is not, you cannot buy a house here as a young family anymore. I mean, there's no, you can, even in the crappiest neighborhood for a little house, there's no houses under 500,000 at all. And most of them are more like 6, 7, 800, that range. So that's not something that people, and the salaries are not at that level. So that's not anything that like young people that are starting off can participate in the way that I could when I was in my 20s.
Yeah, I think it's for the people who are pushing growth, I think for a lot of them it's about the idea of what it would take to kind of decelerate growth, and how blunt the instruments are, because if there was a dial, I think that would be more of a good argument for them. But the idea that it's the government, the government has to intervene with its muddy boots, and a hammer for every nail type situation, where if you look at the strides that the government's done in many a sector, it's like, well, we got in Europe, got GDPR and all sorts of, there's a little string attached to the water bottle cap now, and all sorts of
Really?
insane things that are extremely important, and pictures of tumors on the cigarette packet, and massive strides made by the government,
Yeah.
in processes that take 10 to 15 years to actually do, for 17 committees. Yeah, I mean, I don't know where I stand with this. I mean, I don't believe in infinite growth. I think it's just like the nature of it is impossible. But at the same time, I see the it is really a tough and a tall order to actually implement policies that effectively curtail exactly the things you want to curtail. Because I come from Eastern Europe. The idea of a planned economy is
Yeah,
doesn't work. And the thing
right.
is, you kind of have to calibrate. Okay, at what level doesn't this work? Like, for example, the EPA. I think that's a level where there has to be some sort of intervention. There has to be some way in which kind of these externalities, these costs that companies impose on the environment, have to be paid for by the people who actually, you can't just pollute the rivers. It's just, you can't do that. And then there has to be some sort of system. And there have been all sorts of victories in these domains. But at the same time, even if you see this with how COVID was handled, like, some people think it was great. I don't necessarily agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are all sorts of ways in which, it's just the mechanism is very faulty. And I don't know if it can be improved to a way. And I think a lot of people like Iglesias or Hanania, who's kind of like the right wing
Yeah.
Iglesias, would say that it's just not the right instrument. And it's in most cases, it's just right to just let people do, organically do whatever they would do with their freedom and let it trickle down in whatever way it's going to trickle down. And then maybe you have some sort of cleanup crew to deal with the fallout, but at the very bottom level of it, instead of, messing with the programming at the top, because you're not qualified to do it, especially as like whatever government organ employee.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I mean, I don't think we need to do, I'm not on really one side or the other on that, other than I don't think the government needs to, if people, I mean, interfere to try to get people to have more kids. If they're not, which again, we don't really know, because the trends change all the time. The projections 5 years ago to today to 10 years ago are different, and things turn around and change. We don't necessarily know how long-term trends are, and there is this delay where now women in their 40s are, their fertility rate is way up. In the 30s, it's basically staying the same, and it's the younger 20s and especially teenagers where it's gone way down. If there's an adjustment and it's, as long as it's not, actually collapsing, which it's not, and plenty of people are still having kids, I don't think anything needs to be done personally. Um, but if they do want to try some things, then I mean, they're going to have to be more creative, because some of the stuff is just not, I don't think it's going to work. And I don't know why it would work, because I think what you said is correct, is that if most women, the vast majority, 90%, if they have a reliable, good life partner that they don't think who is going to add to their life and make their life good with a family, are going to want to have kids. And if they don't, then they're not. I mean, or they won't. I mean, they still might. They still might try to do it on their own or with a crappy partner, actually. But for the people that are on, maybe don't feel as strongly about it, that's going to be the decider, I would think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I completely agree. And like in your essay, I think a lot of people just don't do the accounting of the cost to it. And I think, to be honest, I think the right really tends to do a really crappy job of promotional. It's very kind of the most luminous carrot you've ever seen. The idea that, oh, it's going to be the most beautiful thing you've ever done. There's no downsides. Everything's just like roses, and it's not like you two kids, no, six, seven, eight kids on a farm. You need electricity. Your grandma didn't need electricity. And then it's all just like these like bucolic scenes of underwear models with their babies strapped on their back, and they're just, I don't know, plowing the field with a
And
saw or something.
I know plenty of people that actually do have 6 or 7 kids in real life, and it's definitely not that. They are very stressed out, because that is really expensive. I mean, I don't know how they think they're going to pay for that many kids, especially if you want to. I mean, I guess, well, first of all, if you want a farm, you're going to need a bunch of land. So if you're not going to live on a farm, which you're not, then I don't know how you pay for. I don't even know how people pay for 2 kids nowadays, honestly. But yeah, I mean, there's other policies. There's things that can be done to make parents' lives easier. I mean, that's the other thing, is that it just, parents' lives do kind of, at least in the U.S., look like a nightmare. um, for various reasons. Most of them are economic, but some of them, it's the parenting culture just looks awful, and everybody who is a parent complains about it. And yet somehow, even though they all complain about it, like it's some kind of collective action problem where they can't stop it somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know what you do about that. Part of that, I'm guessing, probably is because there are so many more people with only one kid or two kids, and the less you have, the more you're obsessively focused on them, to make people more kind of in that helicoptering mode. Whereas once you have four kids, you just can't be that way, and you just stop caring as much. Kind of, I mean, you just can't. Uh, that's one thing I do really like about it here with the bigger families, is that it is a much more sane parenting culture. And Utah, they adopted the first like free range child law where kids are allowed to walk places on their own, be in a car by their own, play outside without supervision, and parents are not going to get called,
Hmm.
the cops on for doing that. And it's nice because you really do see groups of kids everywhere running around doing what they used to do 20, 30 years ago. And so to me, that seems like normal. But then whenever I have friends come visit me from, the East Coast, they're sort of shocked to see it. And that's sad. So, I mean, everybody, I think, needs to make that change. That would be a simple thing to do. I don't know if there's a reason the political will's not there for that. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
all my friends are moms, and I sometimes lurk on their forums, and I mean, the mom groups seem like crazy a little bit to me. you
Yeah.
know?
They are. They are very crazy. And it's very much, I don't know, it's like kind of like a consumption process. It really has moved from something that just used to happen throughout the course of your life. You want it, you didn't want it, it
Yeah.
kind of happened, to something that's now very much a choice. Like, I know people who had accidental kids, but most people kind of plan out their kids, and it's just like, how many are we going to have? And, you know, everything is very much geared towards, consuming your child and them consuming you. It's very kind of an enmeshed type of thing. Maybe that's just the nature of how we relate to the world nowadays. But it's like, okay, how, what method you going to apply to your child's sleep patterns? How,
Yeah.
how are they going to be fed? Is it going to be baby led weaning, or are you going to use purees and spoon feed them? Like, there's all this like metacognition about the whole life of the child and where they're going to be schooled, and what their group is going to be like. And I think it's just, we're very much very status oriented. I think we've always been status oriented, but we're status oriented in a different way nowadays, because we relate not only to the status of people around us, but to the status of people far away and everyone else, and the culture at large, and what should be done. And I think a lot of women especially are very sensitive to this stuff.
They are very sensitive. I mean, yeah, that's what I mean is when I go on those forums, the intensity of taking easy offense, or thinking somebody doing something different is a judgment on you, and feeling the need to defend yourself and stand up for it, and the sort of factional wars between them, it just looks awful. And I don't know. I mean, it does make sense to me that women probably again, sort of evolutionarily, probably are. I mean, all of history, the world has been a much, much more dangerous place. So your kids were going to die, at least some of them. I mean, pretty much that was almost a guarantee. You really had to be vigilant for them not to die. And maintaining your status and your standing also for your own survival was really important. So if they're kind of keyed for that, and now you put them in a much more safe environment where almost no children die, and everything is generally fine, maybe it just is a little bit crazy making, in the same way that we evolved for not much food, and now we have food around all the time, and it's a struggle because we're just
Yeah.
like, our impulses aren't caught up. I don't know. And I'm sure, of course, social media just makes all this way worse.
Definitely. I think this, the many ways in which your children could die were probably much more abundant back in the day, but the awareness of how they
Right.
could die,
Yeah.
like, oh, there's no pool fence, there's no this, there's been like, 10,000 drownings, and abductions and all these types of
Mm.
stuff, and there's everything's so much closer, so much more vivid. And I think it's an interesting thing, like, I've noticed this, my kids have a nanny who comes, occasionally in the morning so we can do some work. And she's kind of a just like your typical lady from Romania, and she kind of gives me like her stories. And about half of my communication with her, horror stories she picks up from the news. Like I feel like it's like an ingrained female thing to share horror stories, which I think really feeds into the obsession with true crime. Because obviously on right wing Twitter, it's always about, women are just so horny for Ted Bundy. They just want to have sex with Ted Bundy. It's not that. I really don't think it is. Because this
It's
lady,
not.
I probably hasn't been horny for 20 years. It's just the idea that, you want to be aware of danger. You want to be, you want to be plugged into danger. You have to know everything there is to know about all the dangerous people, situations, and things like that. And then you want to be able to, communicate this to other women. Like I think a big chunk of gossip and communicating about what's going on is this communication of, okay, this is dangerous. This is the situation that is dangerous for you and your children. And it's obviously normal for women to absorb this type of stuff and communicate about this stuff because this is how you keep the children alive. And that's really what I think is the main driver of true crime. I'm sure there's some titillation there about this and that, but for most women who are not like hybristophilic maniacs, it's more about like, oh my God, what did Chris Watts do? I can't believe this situation. Let me absorb all of this situation, all of the red flags existent in this story, so that I can be prepared next time I'm in, whatever in life to encounter and deal with something like this. So yeah, it's
Yeah. Well, that it's funny because Ted Bundy in particular went to my law school, and I will say he was very good looking. So
he was very good
yeah,
looking, but
but
that
no, the
does
rest of
not.
them, yeah, no, the rest, no. You listen to it, yeah, you listen to it or you watch it because it's horrifying and you want to know the ways to stay away from it or avoid it or the warning signs or how it happens. Now, I do think there is also a thing where women, a certain subset of women, like guys in prison, and I think that's just because they're locked up and they know that guy is not going to cheat on them. I think that's all that is that they don't have any competition with a guy that's in prison. Um,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think I think there's something to that. And yeah, there's no competition. And these guys are obviously, the kind of guys who have a certain type of will to power. They will go after whatever, they're gonna do breaking and entering, armed assault, things like that. Just things that are not passive. I think the big difference between, the men that are attractive to women and the men that are not attractive to women is that there are passive men who are just kind of going with the flow. They are obviously low status because they cannot exert their will on the world. And then there are active men, which a group that includes, CEOs and also, people who are gang leaders or people who are, just exerting their will on the, someone's jewelry store.
yeah,
But there is something about that, the idea that you're someone, in the words of Walt Bismarck, who has agency. I think the lack of agency is really the ultimate panty dryer. It's just there's nothing worse than a guy who, you can put in there 2 hours later, you come back and he's still there and he's hasn't done anything. And I think it also ties into, women's obsession with, video games and things like that. There's no greater agency suck than the idea that you're going to, win prizes in the online sphere and you're really good at it. And it's just like it's all for something else, for this weird virtual domain. And I'm sure it's relaxing and everything, but a lot of people really just kind of make it their main pursuit. And it's just, it's sucking away your vital energy.
yeah. I saw it looked like there was some kind of discourse on Twitter, which I tried to never ever go on. I don't go on that very often. But recently about women's ranking of men's hobbies, and of course, men are all pissed off about it because they're always pissed off about everything women do. But it was like the number one hobby they hate is video games. It was a bunch of stuff that they actually like doing, but all of them involving things that are just sitting on your butt for hours and hours a day. And then the ones that they liked were all active, doing things type or productive or, building things and whatever. So, and I don't even know the original study where that came from and whether
Yeah,
or not it's
apparently it
true,
was
but
made up, but
yeah,
it
but I mean,
rang
it seems
true.
like it would be true. I can't imagine anything more My husband does play video games sometimes, and I would say I'm not a huge fan of it, but he doesn't do it enough that it's a big deal. But like for younger women, I mean, I do know that some of them I have known are in relationship with guys that do nothing but play video games all the time. And I mean, that is the kind of guy that probably at some point either she's going to lay down the law and make him change it, or she's going to stay with him and be very unhappy or leave him. I mean, I don't know. Somebody that is like that is just, I don't see how you raise a kid with somebody like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the mommy forums, they're filled with stories like that.
Yeah.
The young wannabe patriarch of 10 sometimes can't be, unstuck from the gaming console to actually tend to his patriarchal duties. So yeah, it's a conundrum. You also had a really interesting essay about, femininity being constructed and masculinity not being. I think that was an interesting perspective. I mean, what do you mean by that? I mean, I have a feeling I know what you mean by that, but maybe you can you could expound on it.
Yeah. Well, the view of sort of gender and femininity and masculinity has changed pretty radically over my lifetime. So, like my parents, my mom especially, but both of them really, kind of were having kids during the 70s free to be you and me era where there was not really any emphasis on gender differences. In fact, it was the opposite. Like it was all seemingly constructed. That was a big thing in the 70s. So by the time I came around and my cohort, we were sort of raised with that a little bit. And then in the 90s, it all kind of came back with the princess stuff. But back then, whenever I would talk to, or really like in the first decade of the 2000s, whatever we call that, guys seem to assume that women's experience of femininity was the same as theirs of masculinity. And I just don't think that's true. I think most men feel that their true masculinity is being suppressed by society, which it is, because we don't let them act like complete barbarians. And a big chunk of them would want to. If there was no restrictions, they would be more masculine than they are in the sense of violence and a lot of characteristics that are pretty repressed in them. Whereas that is not how most women experience. We don't feel like we're being repressed in our femininity, and I think guys like to view it that way so that they can blame it on like, oh, the feminists are trying to repress your natural femininity. If it wasn't for those feminists, you guys would just love, twirling around in a skirt all day or whatever. I don't know. I don't know what they think. That's really not true. It feels very imposed upon us. It's what most of us are upset about. If we're saying we're not annoyed by it at least some level or whatever, it's mostly because we don't want a guy to think we're annoyed by it because we want him to think we don't mind or that it comes naturally to us because that's what guys want it to be. Um, the sort of there's a big chunk, I would argue, of trans men, the one that are straight before they transition and lesbians after, who basically just have a fetish for femininity, which is a performance for men. I mean, that's mostly what it is a performance to attract men because they like it so much. It's not so when there's not men around, women are much less feminine. Now there are, in my opinion, some real womanly like inherent qualities, but they're not the ones that most men think of when they think of femininities. I mean, there are um, uh, traits of how women act around each other, social kind of characteristics, gossip and passive aggression, and that kind of thing. And obviously fierce maternal love and protection of children. All of that is true, and that has nothing to do with society. But the stuff that guys tend to think of as feminine and be mad at the feminists for trying to stamp out or whatever, and or want to achieve if they transition are a bunch of completely artificial. I mean, it's just artifice. It's completely artifice. And I mean, and I participate in it, and so does most women who are heterosexual.
Yeah, of course you can't opt out. I mean, I grew up in Eastern Europe. I
Yeah,
mean, this
yeah,
is, in my blood, putting makeup on. I don't think there's been maybe like, a dozen days in my life where I didn't have some sort of makeup on.
yeah.
It's just, yeah, it is, I think, because I think both sexes have a problem with putting themselves in the shoes of the other sex. But I think, the level of artifice and work that goes into, most heterosexual presenting women is really, like, until you like are married to a woman and really do pay close attention to all of the stuff that she does to do all of the things, you can laugh it off and say, giggle at the whatever med spa stuff that she's doing and the this and the that. But it's like hours a day that we do
Oh,
and we put into
yeah.
our parents. And a lot of the argument it's like, oh, is just gay fashion designers. No, actually, no, it wasn't gay fashion designers. It was women picking up on the cues that men respond to. Like, it
Mhm.
wasn't gay fashion designers that told women that they should get breast implants.
Right,
Things
right.
things like that.
Yeah,
There are certain things, and the thing is, the men do notice women who overdo it. But the thing is, even for women who overdo it, there's a huge market. Like, they're doing much
yeah,
better than they
that's true.
used to, with the
Yeah,
huge fake eyelashes
yeah.
and the huge boobs, and it's like, it's not classy. It isn't classy, but for whatever, ghetto ass situation that they're in, they're the most beautiful woman in their corner. And, they had to pay for whatever nails and things like that because that's part of their culture. They don't want to be the classiest woman. And yeah, I think it's, all of this escalation is definitely, it's a female intersexual competition, but the competition is for male attention. It's
Yeah, it
for
is, yeah.
it's for men.
I mean, and there's a lot of men that are convinced that that's not the case because women say it, and it's like those women are just trying to. They just don't want to admit it because it makes them seem pathetic, or so they'll say, "Oh, it's just for me." No, it's not. Give me a break. You're not looking at yourself. Or it's for my friend. No, it's not for other women. I mean, women say that for a couple of reasons. Like, one, they say it because they don't want to invoke the guy's jealousy. So if he's like, "Hey, how come you're so dressed up to go out without me?" They don't want him to think that she's trying to look good when he's not around. So that's like just tamp down his jealousy. And second, they don't want to say that it's for men because it does make you sound kind of pathetic. Like, why do you have to try so hard to attract men, especially if you already have one? But I mean, I'm the same as you. I mean, I wear makeup every day since 6th grade. And it's not always because I'm actively going out trying to attract a man, but most men will be nicer to you if they think that you look pretty. Even if it's just in a completely minor way, the guy working at the bakery who's a cashier or an old man, I mean, they'll be nicer to you and they're certainly less likely to be aggressive or rude or hostile if you look pretty. Um, So yeah, so that's I don't know. Maybe it's better for men to think that women do it just for each other, but it's not true. And the weeks when my husband travels and goes out of town, I am so much more productive because that's just a bunch of time cut out, and I could just look like crap the entire time as long as I'm working at home. If I go to work, then I can't.
Yeah.
That's what I mean, and that's a huge reason why I think women were so into working at home more so than men even and didn't want to go back is because that was like saved them 5 hours a week just on that. A lot of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also kind of a pressure point that I think a lot of men don't realize. When you live with a man, there's a lot of things you can't do anymore. Or if you're not a complete, slob, you're never at ease. You're never completely at ease. If he's not in the room, maybe you're at ease, but he
Right.
might be in the next room. You never,
Yeah.
So you kind of have to be always a little bit on your toes, a little bit, a little bit putting on the show of femininity, the one that you obviously know very well, but it is a show. It's not like, if you're completely relaxed, it's not what you would be doing. You would be looking really, really bad and, or whatever within the standards of how women should be looking. So yeah, it is an interesting thing. I mean, this kind of plays into the whole thing of, there's just those stats about, men thriving in marriage and women kind of being worn down by it. It's like there's all these little costs. I mean, children are a big cost. I have to say, I aged about 10 years in the last 3, I used to be quite sprightly, bendy, bushy tailed. And now it's taking it out of me. I'm
Yeah.
trying to claw myself back into
Yeah.
my age bracket,
Well,
but I'm still down there.
it does to fathers too. Yeah.
Yeah, for
But
sure, for sure. Like my husband is now gray haired. It's
yeah,
happened in
right.
the last 3 years. It's
Yeah.
incredible. I didn't used to believe in this whole like, stress turns you gray, but apparently it actually does. So yeah, it is what it is. It's just, the cost of it. And you mentioned that in your essay as well. I think it really is. It's also hard to talk about, because as a woman, it's all about this whole like you don't want to be pathetic. You want to bounce back. You don't want to think that it takes it out of you, but honestly, it really does. Like there's all sorts of creaky bone structures that I didn't used to have back in the day, like all sorts of things. And obviously, I've gotten 3 years older, but it's just not proportionate to the amount of aging that I've done in the last 3 years. And
Yeah.
if I ever want to look similar to what I used to look like, massive surgery is involved. Like there has to be stapling involved. Things
Yeah.
have to be stapled back to other things.
Right.
Not
Well,
gonna
I
work.
mean, and again, in Utah where people do still have a lot of kids, it's also like the plastic surgery capital of the world. I mean, it's super common. The mommy makeover is pretty par for the course, even though that's, cost $35,000 and a month in recovery. It's a pretty big deal to have a tummy tuck and boob job, that's, yeah, that's the, I don't know. I think guys really underestimate. I mean, it depends. There's so many different subcultures because I mean, I've also lived in like some of the most liberal places, and if you're in sort of Seattle or Washington, Oregon, Vermont, those kind of places, a lot of these pressures are really reduced, and there's more sort of gender parity. There's not as much. The standards are lower for appearance. It's just, it's just a different thing. But I just don't think these angry kind of young guys on the right, who most of them, I don't get the impression I've even been in a relationship with a woman. How much work women do, especially women that are economically dependent on their husband, to keep his interest, and that it is like a constant struggle. And I'm sort of, because I mean I'm in my 40s, and I'm very interested to see how this continues to play out sort of after, you know like in the 50s and sort of menopause and post that age, because I think in the past, those women just never even talked about that because it was too sort of horrifying and scary that a man might hear about it and what's going to happen. But you millennials love to talk about everything, and you guys. But I think that's a good thing because I'm very curious. I can't seem to get any good information whenever it is talked about online. I just get a sense that like half the women are lying. I don't know. Maybe they're not. Maybe there's just a variation of experiences. But
Yeah, it really is. It really is a variation of experiences because, it's, I think also age plays a little bit. I think, millennials tend to be older when they have kids. And, I guess it's just, it takes a bit of more of a toll on you if you're not like, 20. But, it really varies, the impact on you in terms of pregnancy. I had very easy pregnancies. Then, breastfeeding is also extremely difficult. First one was impossible. Second one just doesn't want to get off of me. So it's just like very different. And then obviously you have, the temperaments of the children. Like the load of parenting is incredibly diverse in terms of how temperamental your children are. Like my first child, he's quite feral. He's like a wolf child, and he's constantly in danger, constantly destroying property. We try to reason with him, gentle parenting, all this type of stuff, but it's just, that's his character. He has to kind of get it out of his system. My second child is, angel, cherub, absolutely, chill, no problem with him. If I had my first one first, I would think, my parenting style is insane. I'm now, I've tamed the little beast, and I have no problems with him. But it really, really depends. And this is a child made by the same two people, same
yeah,
genetic material, just
right,
combined in different ways. And
right,
really, a lot of people who have very stern opinions on parenting have one child.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And that's another reason that I think the parenting culture here is better, is because people, almost nobody has an only child here, and you can't have that sort of delusion because it's so obvious people's temperaments. I mean, even now I can go back. I've been looking through some old diaries and like stuff from elementary school for something I'm writing, and I'm still in touch with a lot of those people, and like they're this. I mean, they really are the same people they were in third grade in other ways. It's quite fascinating how easily you could have predicted kind of a lot of people's outcomes and who they ended up being. I mean, temperament's very inborn, and some kids are so much easier than others. Um, Although I have to say, for me, because most of my friends, because people have kids so much younger here. Most of my friends have teenagers or even like college age students. And it's funny to watch. I always am interested to see the transition, because like parents in your situation with young kids are just exhausted and stressed, and it's just trying to make it through, kind of, and then you enter the golden period of elementary school age, basically sort of the 5 to 10, and everything's great and being a parent is the most wonderful thing. And then the teenagers, and boy, that really takes a hit. I mean, although it sort of depends, girls are worse than boys, it seems, teenager wise. And then they like it again. That's a sort of fairly predictable kind of course of, like, from my observations, to see how that goes. But I do. Can I ask you why? I don't understand. Why do all these millennials even want to gentle parent? That seems crazy to me.
I think it's just safetyism partly. It's also like, the idea that just trauma culture, the idea that a lot of millennials are convinced that whatever's going wrong in their life is because their parents, took a wrong turn or yelled at them, or, they were spanked or something like that. And yeah, I think it's therapy, all of this stuff. People are very reliant on their childhood to give them a narrative of why, they can't cope with stress. There's all these psychiatric diagnoses as identity type things that are very popular among millennials. I have ADHD, I've got anxiety, I've got this depression, things like that. And then they need a culprit, and who's going to be to blame? It's always mommy. Mommy did something wrong. Mommy spanked me. Mommy told me that I was ugly, that I was fat, things like that. I think that's, and I think a lot of millennials are really convinced that that was really impactful. And so they don't want to, continue generational cycles. And I think that's, commendable. But I think also, I don't know, gentle parenting is tough. It really depends on the kid, to be honest. We've been very gentle with my firstborn, and he just, no. It just
Yeah.
doesn't work. You kind of have to grab him and hold him in a football hold and just like take him to a safe place and try to not let him hurt you while he's, having a tantrum, because he's also somehow extremely big. He's 3 years old. He looks like a 6 year old. He's strong. He's got abs. Like, I don't know what puppy dog tails entered the combination there, but he's hardcore. So yeah, it's
Well,
just,
they'll probably be great for when he's older. All
oh
those all
yeah, for
those
sure.
traits.
Some
Yeah.
sort of sport, some sort
Yeah.
of violence he's going to be
Yeah.
involved in. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is. He's also super lovely, loving, a wonderful child in many ways. But he's got crazy amounts of energy. He's curious. He doesn't like the word no, and he's just going to do whatever he wants. And then we just kind of have to save him from himself like 50 times a day. And that's just my job now, just constantly supervising this crazy kid and trying to prevent, involuntary suicide.
Right.
Yeah.
I I don't know. I mean, it's fascinating to me to see this, what you're talking about with the trauma thing and the parenting, and then cutting off their own parents, and all of this, when, like, their parents were nicer to them by far than any parents have ever been in the history of humanity, by far. I mean, so I just don't understand how they've come to the conclusion that they're also traumatized and had these terrible childhoods, when that's like clearly not the case. I mean, it's very strange to me. And I don't know. It actually it upsets me to see people. I mean, I just see these Instagram reels and stuff where there's some millennial woman who's now a mom herself of young children, usually basically telling her own mom to screw off and she's not in her life anymore over just, in my opinion, very minor things. It just seems awful. And I'm not sure why they're so confident that that's not going to happen to them too. Um, you know,
Yeah, well, when they're
or
small, you can still have the idea that, you're gonna do everything right, or at least you're gonna do things better than your parents did. But yeah, it is pretty impossible to do everything right. I mean, you can have the intention, but also I think it ties also to how a lot of internet culture and especially politics has turned into identity for people. I think a lot of these, schisms are happening on the basis of politics. Like people really they can't stand their parents at dinner because they have different politics or they have different positions on the vaccine or all sorts of divides between old and young that just seem like insurmountable nowadays because people are so in their phones, they're so invested in these narratives. Like, I'm guilty of that myself. I was, plugged into a lot of this stuff myself, but it's like it really is not none of it, even the most important narrative about the toxicity of the vaccine or anything is not as important as your relationship with your parents. And
yeah,
it's just, yeah, the fact that people can't divide the stuff anymore. I think this is definitely something that has to change. And I think it's probably going to change. I think people are waking up to the fact that we're all kind of in a trance from all this stuff. Whatever medium is your favorite, like Instagram's all about Palestine and stuff like that. Divorcing your parents over Palestine or something. That's happened too. I've seen this.
really.
Yeah, yeah. People who
Well, I mean, it's just, yeah, to me that is horrific. And for anybody who wants to encourage more people to have kids and fertility and everything, that they need to do something to stop that, because what could be more of a disincentive than the possibility that your kid could just easily completely cut you off and say you're not in my life anymore as soon as they hit 20, because of some minor stuff that you didn't wasn't totally perfect to them. I mean, that's just horrific to me. I mean, and don't get me wrong, my mother and I were at war pretty much from when I was 12 to 17. I mean, we did not get along, but that's just because whatever. I was a strong-willed teenager, and I didn't think she should be telling me what to do. It's not like my parents were perfect, but I don't know if they're not beating you or neglecting you, locking you in a room, not feeding you. I don't know. It just seems so incredibly self-centered and rude and horrible to cut them off. I mean, I think that's awful. Um, and I'm surprised they don't seem to have that sense at all. And that to me, I think is horrifying. So I guess I'm on the side of the boomers on this one, even though
yeah,
I'm not.
I think it's just also like the relationship that most people have to the world and the people around them is kind of a consumption relationship. So I think, like I was saying, parents tend to consume their children. They're kind of part of their consumption identity. That's the same way children try to consume their parents. Like, or does this fit within the identity that I have formed myself as, the consumer of X and Y identities? And then it's just a completely different level of relationship that you should be having with your parents, but somehow because we're just so steeped in all this this kind of modus operandi, it yeah, it's become how we consume our relationships as well. Because yeah, I mean, if your parents are not on board with your seven identities as a dog mom and a whatever, it's probably going to be hard because that's what you occupy your brain with 24/7. And then you go to dinner with your mom and she's in a completely different rabbit hole. Like she's a Facebook Republican. Like,
Hmm.
whoa, what even
Hmm.
is she about?
Yeah. Well, trust me, all of this craziness has, in fact, trickled into the dog mom world. As somebody with two dogs, I unfortunately discovered the dog people are just as much at each other's throats, and their opinions of what's okay and what's not okay. And there's gentle parenting for dogs too, which is completely insane. So I don't know, the more that I learn about the the kind of Zoomer generation and the younger millennials, the more I honestly just start thinking the internet needs to be banned for them until they're like 25, because I don't know. It just never seemed to get. I keep hearing people say, "Oh, I think maybe the pendulum's going to swing back and people will move away from it," but are they really going to? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe the really educated sort of upper class ones will. I don't know if I see that happening with regular kind of working class people. Seems hard to
Yeah,
imagine.
I think so. I think, like in everything, there's going to be a big divide. I think people, upper middle class and more educated will split off, and there's going to be definitely a kind of a more de-digitalizing, or at least a very selective engagement with digital. And then the rest, the flood can take the rest, and they can, drown in their dopamine traps. And if you're not agentic enough to pull
Man.
yourself up, then you will be eaten alive by whatever Facebook memes and tribal wars on the internet and things like that.
Oh boy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to have a lot of effects like in the actual, real political world. I think, things are, the internet has less power than people actually imagine it does. I mean, memes trickle into reality, but not at the scale that people involved in internet politics imagine that they do. Like, especially, the effectiveness of being an internet pundit is quite low. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's true, although I don't know about the youngest people whether that will remain true. I don't know. Because it does occur to me that one of the problems is that people on the internet are a certain type of person, and a lot of the people, and if you're not that kind of person, you're not on it, or you're not commenting, you're not participating. And I was talking to my husband about this the other night, because he asked me, he didn't know what an incel was, which I was like, how can you not know what that I've known what that is for at least a decade. And then I thought about it, and it's like guys like him, and he is successful in every realm that he would want to be in life person. So, if anybody should be giving their opinions to young guys or on the internet, it's somebody like him. Well, he doesn't engage in it. And I asked him about this, and his attitude is totally like, fuck them all, basically. I mean,
Yeah.
he doesn't care. The only reason he goes on is for sports. That's it. And he's not engaged, and there's nobody really like that, or very few people. So their voice, the people that are succeeding in their various endeavors, is completely left out. And instead, it's just very sort of cerebral, introverted, certain personality type that gets amplified. But and so far, you're right. It has not. I mean, I don't know. I think since sort of 2008, it has been getting a little bit more and more internet, as far as politics goes. But once the boomers are sort of out of the picture, and it's like then the Zoomers are in charge, is that still going to stay? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, if you look at who's actually, on the ballot, like, I don't know exactly if these are very I mean, who actually trickles to the realms of power, and what actually are they able to do? Because I mean, a lot of what agitated internet discourse in 2016 was the fact that Trump, was voted in, but he didn't really have the levers of power. Like, what actually happens behind the scenes is anyone's guess. But yeah, we can all look at the puppet show and clap and participate and get angry and
Yeah.
so yeah, i I wonder. Yeah, I mean, I have a few other things here, but I know we're coming up on time, so I'm going to ask you the question of the show, which is, do you have any sort of recommendations, a subversive thinker that you'd like that people should check out, someone maybe underrated?
Let's see. Well, a lot of the people that I would recommend you've had on your, at least from Substack, you've had on your show. So I would tell people to just go scroll through, the people that you've been interviewing the past month. A lot of them. I don't know that he would qualify as subversive, but I just found out that my absolute favorite writer is on Substack. His name is Tim Kreider. He's got his Substack's called The Loaf, and he just he's a fantastic writer. I love him. I'm not even going to try to categorize him. As far as subversive thinkers go, honestly, a lot of times I think stand-up comedians are sort of on the cutting edge of that, and I really am into stand-up comedy. As far as somebody who can walk the line and tell a lot of actually, in my opinion, true things about sort of gender relations and relationships between men and women, that's appealing to all different types of audiences and just incredibly funny. Bill Burr is always the classic that I would recommend any of his stand-up specials.
Yeah, I agree. I love Bill Burr. Okay, perfect. Well, is there any place that you'd like people to check out? I know you're on Substack. I'll put it in the show notes. Any other thing that people should be checking out?
Nope, that would be it.
Cool, perfect.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for coming. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support my work, have access to the full archive of every episode I've ever recorded, to the full archive of everything I've ever written, and the community features that are so interesting on Substack, please do go to alexdeshuda.com. If you just want to access the audio version of the podcast and every other episode of the podcast, please do go to patreon.com/aksubversive. Thank you so much for participating, for listening, and for supporting me. It's really, really appreciated.